All right, all right. Welcome to the Iconic Podcast Studio. My name is Sandy Cerami, your host for Icons, Influencers, and Inspirations, along with my right-hand guy, Mr. Ron Marvo. And he's got quite a right hand. He is a former Golden Gloves champ. And we delivered a knockout episode to kick off 2022 with Brian Wesbury. Brian's the chief economist over at First Trust Advisors. He's also the #1 rated economic forecaster in the country. We talked about something called the Great Reset, and you're going to want to pay attention to what Brian has to say about what that means to everyday Americans and how we can offer an alternative, something called freedom, to the Great Reset. As a matter of fact, if you like what you hear when you put it in your ear, make sure you leave us a 5-star review on either Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please make sure you like and click that subscribe button and share that video with your friends. We also want to hear your comments. So if you got something to say, drop it in the comments section below. We'll respond in kind. In the meantime, a couple of quick thank yous to our sponsor partners. We got the crew over at J&L Marketing in Louisville, Kentucky, that deliver the kind of digital marketing results every business owner dreams of. So if you're looking to move the crowd, crush the competition, and count your money, look them up at jandlmarketing.com. That's JANDL marketing.com. And let's give a shout out to the crew over at Traction, formerly Tire Profiles, out of Irving, Texas, and CEO Dave Boyle and his team, helping dealers and independent repair facilities drive higher loyalty, retention, and profitability with every customer that drives into their dealership or their independent repair center. In the meantime, we're going to check out what my man Brian Wesbury has to say. So I'm going to step up to stand out. Let's check it out. All right, everybody, welcome back to Icons, Influencers, and Inspirations. This is our first show of 2022. I'm wildly excited. Ron knows how excited I am about today's episode because we have an opportunity to talk to somebody who is not only an Eagle Scout, but he's been ranked the #1 economic forecaster in the country. He is a top 5 global keynote speaker. He's done approximately 200 plus speeches a year for quite some time. He is currently the chief economist at First Trust Advisors over the course of about the last 16 plus years, based out of Chicago. He is also a 1982 graduate of the University of Montana with a BA in economics. And I kidded him before that he graduated on the John Dutton Scholarship Program, which I know gave him a bit of a chuckle. He's also a graduate of the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University with a MA in finance and organizational behavior. He's written 2 books, which I highly recommend. You can find them on Books A Million. You can find them on Amazon. The first book is It's Not As Bad As You Think, published in 2009 by Wiley & Sons. And the second book is The New Era of Wealth, published originally in 1999 by McGraw-Hill. So he's an avid fly fisherman. He's a cigar lover. And right now trying to figure out whether he wants to spend more of his golden years at the beach or spend more time in the mountains. I know he spent a ton of time in the mountains as well, but please welcome Brian Wesbury. Brian, how are you?
Hey, Sandy, I am really, really well, and it's great to be with you. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to all your listeners.
Appreciate that, my friend. Happy New Year to you too. And I tell you, I think that there's a spiritual connection here. I don't think that there are any accidents or coincidences in the world. And when you talk about the concept of ideas, which we'll get into later on in the podcast, I think this is a little bit of divine intervention that I've stumbled upon, what I'm going to call the genius of Brian Wesbury. And the reason I call it the genius of Brian Wesbury is really simple. I think you have an incredible brain, but you're able to articulate in a way that everybody can understand. And that's a real talent. I think that's a gift from our friend above. And so that is really what has drawn me to you, quite honestly, over the course of the last few weeks. I stumbled upon your speech. The great Dr. Orrin at Hillsdale College hosted CCA, the Center for Constructive Alternatives 2, where we talked about the Great Reset, which is our topic today. And without any further, let me just stop for just a second. I got my right-hand guy, Mr. Ron Marvo here, gracing the screen. He's the good-looking dude on the screen to the left. So I don't want to forget to introduce him. He is my cohort in crime. But I don't believe that there's any accidents, Brian. I think that divine intervention brings people together, and I think it was timely that I discovered, Brian, and what you've been speaking about over the course of the last few weeks. Let's talk a little bit about your background before we get into it, Brian. Can you tell us a little bit about how you
Sure.
grew up and who was an influence on you as you grew up?
Yeah, without going into all the little minor details, I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My dad was getting his master's in hospital administration there at the time. We ended up moving to Gainesville, Florida at a very young age. He took over Shands Teaching Hospital in Gainesville at the University of Florida, which was a huge job. There's actually a whole big story about that because he quit that job to go get his PhD. And I think part of that was, I think he made $24,000 a year. I remember us getting our second car, it was a Ford Falcon, and so we lived a good middle class lifestyle. But whoever's the head of that hospital today is making millions, would never quit that job to go get a PhD. So the world has changed in so many different ways. And then he ended up becoming, after his PhD, a professor at the University of Missouri. And so I really grew up in Missouri, the show me state.
Sure.
And maybe it's partly those Midwest roots that I have. Also, my dad, by the way, was a supporter of Barry Goldwater way back in the day.
Yep.
He was a precinct committeeman. So he was active. I was young. I didn't really understand all of this, but around the dinner table, we must have grown up with a lot of, talk about virtue and liberty. We were Methodist. We went to church, every week. It was a super important part of our family upbringing. And then I was a Boy Scout, and you mentioned it that I'm an Eagle Scout. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really once you're an Eagle Scout, you're always an Eagle Scout. You know, and so that part of my life, growing up, I'm sure around the table talking about hospitals and education and PhDs and politics and being in Boy Scouts made me a true patriot. I don't use that word in a radical sense. I love America, like to the deepest core of my being, and it's that part of my bringing up. Now, in the midst of becoming an Eagle Scout, I went to Philmont in New Mexico, which is a big Boy Scout ranch.
Mm-hmm.
I did some rock climbing while I was there. I fell in love with it. I was a wrestler, so I could always do fingertip pull-ups, which you really need to do when you rock climb. And I used to go to Colorado to climb in the summers, and then there were so many people there, it was like Disneyland. So I visited my buddy in Missoula, Montana, and we had a 5-mile canyon to ourselves. And I'm like, this is where I want to go to school. And to be absolutely honest about it, I ended up skiing, fishing, floating, and climbing. I have no idea how I graduated because that is God's playground out there, and I enjoyed every bit of it, and I still love the mountains. But then I'm going to shorten it up from here because I don't want to go too far. But I graduated in 1982, and the unemployment rate was 13%. I loved Montana, but you had to rob a bank to get a teller's job.
Yeah.
You couldn't get a job, and so I fell in love with economics. The very first class I ever took. That's all I ever wanted to do. I'm the most blessed guy in the
Amen.
career department that I know of because that's all I've ever done. And what happened to me is I came back to Chicago where my parents had moved, and that's another story. But I went to this massive cocktail party of all these hospital administrators, and I ended up I popped a beer next to this couple, and it was a man and a hospital administrator and his wife from Hannibal, Missouri. So this couldn't have been more than a 60-bed hospital. He was true, perfect Midwest, Hannibal, Missouri guy. You put the picture in your mind. This is not Hollywood. This is not DC. This is Midwest.
We need more of that, Brian. We need a lot more of those folks.
Exactly. And we sat down and talked. And there were all these, highfalutin people all over the room. And I just fell in love with this couple. They weren't young. And he goes, I know a guy that works at the Harris Bank. Let me write a letter. And he actually wrote the letter. And it was, and I went in, they go, well, good luck, because we're actually cutting the department. Anyway, long story short, a lady quit. I ended up getting the job. I call myself the assistant to the junior assistant economist. And all I did back then was keep data by hand on cards. Like by hand, in pencil. I had to erase every time they revised data. I had to erase it all, and then I made charts by hand to go to the printer when we published our little pieces. And I never wrote them. I just made the charts, and then slowly but surely I grew in my career. And one thing about sticking to it is that eventually you learn it. And I feel like I've been totally blessed to be able to grow from the ground floor, like literally the mailroom, in a sense, in an economics department, keeping the data by hand, all the way to becoming a chief economist now of a pretty significant money management firm. And so I've met amazing people along the way. I worked 2 years in Washington, D.C. I was the chief economist of the Joint Economic Committee. I worked for Connie Mack, who was the senator from Florida. As a result there, I met the Wall Street Journal editorial people. I know Art Laffer, Larry Kudlow, Jude Winniski, who used to run the Wall Street Journal, Bob Bartley, who ran it.
All just, superstars.
Yeah, well, it was all because I ended up getting this job at the Harris Bank because of the help of this Midwest, hospital director, a true gentleman. From Missouri. And so it's weird how things work, and everybody wants to look over everybody's shoulder and look for the more handsome or the more beautiful or the more powerful or the better dressed. And that's not where everything always starts. And so for me, it started literally having a beer with a guy from Missouri. My upbringing mattered too, but and then him following through on a promise that he made that night. It was just, I pinch myself when I think of my career.
Well, Brian, you reference him doing what he said he was going to do, and that is such a hallmark of the Midwestern attitudes and philosophies that I bump into when I travel the country, and it's refreshing, and it shouldn't be so refreshing, right?
Right, I totally agree.
It shouldn't be an anomaly. It should be the norm. It's funny because it brings me back to an episode of Yellowstone, watching John Dutton change a tire on the side of the road for a woman and her son. And he basically says, hey, around here, we just do it because it's the right thing to do. She was offering to pay him to change a flat tire. But it spoke volumes about that Midwestern attitude. And so I completely identify with where you're coming from. But again, I don't think there are any accidents, right? I don't think that that you incidentally end up sitting next to that gentleman and having that kind of conversation. I believe that the man upstairs puts us on a path, right? And it's up to us to make decisions and take actions,
Yeah, and that's why I end up here, Sandy, because you feel that way, and we both have that connection, and we never knew it. And by the way, I do radio every Wednesday morning with Hugh Hewitt, who found me the same way. And his email to me was, hey, wait a minute, you are an adjunct professor at Wheaton College. Is that a worldview thing, or is that just because it's close by? And I'm like, it's a worldview thing. He goes, we got it. Like, bingo. So, and so many people don't understand that. It's sometimes to people, I think it sounds like a foreign language or some kind of code, but it really is a worldview. It's a way of life. And what's great about it is you're attracted to people that have that worldview, and that's cool. It's great to be here with you.
Well, Brian, I'm beyond humbled and honored. Ron and I have been talking about it for the past couple of days. We've been really excited to have the chance to speak with you. But I have to tell you that when I watched, and again, I got to reference Dr. Larry Arnn, because he's a hero, quite honestly, in my opinion. And I think you share the same sentiment, because I've heard you speak about Larry, and I've never had the opportunity to meet him. I will shake that man's hand at some point in the future. I will manifest that, because I believe that what he stands for and what he's doing for the young adults in our country right now is absolutely required if we're going to get out of this mess that we're in, economically as a country.
Totally agree.
So when I heard you speak, and I listened to all 7 of the speeches at CCA2, and I highly recommend anybody to go out there. We talk about Googling that, Google it, CCA2 at Hillsdale College, the Great Reset, which is really going to be the topic of what we're talking about here. You called your speech the only or the true alternative to the Great Reset. And I want to dive into what you spoke about at CCA2 because it really hit home with me. And I was gravitating towards you immediately. I listened to that speech 2 or 3 times because I said there's so much in there that is in alignment with what I believe we need to have happen in this country today. Let's go to Ecclesiastes 1:4 through 11 and what King Solomon said, and I'll let you take it from there. He said what?
Yeah, I paraphrase, there's nothing new under the sun. And, man doesn't change. And that's partly, I am now an evangelical Christian. I was born in the Methodist kind of family, but we read the Bible. I went every week, heard the pastor speak, and so all that seeps into you over the years. And so there are certain things in the Bible that I can't quote the Bible as well as a lot of people, but that one comes to my mind all the time.
The best of these 3 folks here, I can tell you that. I promise you.
Right. Yeah. And so, but there is nothing new under the sun. And the reason I reference that is because we've all heard of this idea now, the Great Reset. And I actually have to tell you, Sandy, until Dr. Arnn, until Hillsdale College asked me to do this speech, that they and the CCA was about the Great Reset, I thought the Great Reset was a conspiracy theory.
Yep.
If you're on Twitter, like people are talking about Bill Gates wanting to put a microchip in your veins, and I do believe that currencies are always under attack, but that we're going to replace the dollar with the SDR, and we're not, your all your money's going to be controlled by a global trilateral commission, like that kind of, and I thought it was that. And then so when they asked me to speak on this, I of course said yes. And then I went and ordered the book, and it's a real book, and it's written by Klaus Schwab, who is the founder of the World Economic Forum. And most people will go, okay, what's that? Well, those are the people that have that Davos meeting. And so this is where all the heads of Google, the finance minister of Germany, the finance treasurer of China, all the richest, and Bill Gates goes all the time, and all the hedge fund billionaires. And they are the elite of the elite of the elite in terms of power and money. And they go to this Davos meeting. And so Klaus Schwab is the head of that, and he's the one who wrote the book. So all of a sudden I went, this just isn't a conspiracy theory. So what's in this book? And I'm going to paraphrase the book, and maybe it's fair, maybe it's not fair, but it's what I got out of it. And so first of all, think of the title, COVID-19, the Great Reset. Now, this book was published in July of 2020.
First red flag, Brian. First red flag for me.
Right, exactly. We didn't know anything about COVID at the time. I mean, we had we knew a little. It was a virus. It was out there. But all of a sudden, there's a book laying out why, because of the virus, we had to change our whole world and the relationship between government and man. And the argument, I'm going to simplify it, goes like this: climate change causes more respiratory viruses, which, by the way, is not true. But nonetheless, that's where it starts. Climate change causes more respiratory viruses. Respiratory viruses unequally affect people in the world, and they affect lower incomes more than higher incomes. So that drives inequality, and then inequality in a lot of the progressive mindset is one of the reasons that creates climate change.
Right.
And then therefore climate change now causes more respiratory viruses. And it's this circle that you can never get out of. And the only way to fix it, according to the book, is for the government to take over massive parts of our world, our economy, our decision making, redistribute massive amounts of global GDP. And that's what the Great Reset is about. And so to go back to King Solomon, there's nothing new under the sun. See, the Marxists were trying to do this.
Yep.
They didn't have the Great Reset. They didn't have COVID-19. We tried to
They
do
didn't
it
have
again.
social media, Brian.
Right, exactly. We tried to do it in the New Deal with the Depression. We tried to do it after every war. There's nothing new. The progressive politicians, they've existed forever, if you will. We just call them that today. But people that they almost the desire for feudalism, for ultimate power over other people, has been with us forever.
Sure.
And so there's nothing new under the sun, and that's what I meant. And the Great Reset, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just laying out those same historical ideas and political desires in a different argument.
Yeah, no, you are spot on. And it's funny because when I thought about what you had said during your speech about the fact that this is nothing new, they've recycled some literally centuries old philosophy, but they have new tools. And I think that's what's new. They've got new tools that they're going to employ in the form of social media, in the form of alliances, in my opinion, between big media, government. I see, and again, I'm not going to disappear down the rabbit hole, but when I see CNN and the reporting, or what they call reporting on the screen, really as an extension of the federal government, that's the kind of stuff that really causes pause for me and concern ultimately. The other thing that I think is interesting, Larry, Brian, I think it's interesting to think about this is, you talked about the Trilateral Commission, and we were talking yesterday in our prep call, and he said, you're not sure if I would remember that. I'm only a couple of years behind you. So yes, I do recall the Trilateral Commission, and I know what the conspiracy theorists say out there, but using that as just a base point. The reason I think the conspiracy theorists exist and why it's become so overblown over the last few years is because there's such a fundamental lack of transparency at the governmental level globally. Okay.
Yep, totally agree.
Interesting irony is that Klaus Schwab and his crew and the book kind of pull the transparency piece out, and they just come out and say, this is what we're doing.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
It's almost like they're using their transparency as a shield. They're saying, we're not making any bones about this. This is what we fundamentally believe, even though they're using, I think, a lot of red herrings to advance their cause.
Right.
I think that they're using transparency as a shield.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just to go back to your quick comment about the press, Lara Logan just made a tweet the other day. So I hopefully I can, it's a picture, so hopefully I can do this in words.
Sure.
But you have the politician and then the press, and the press has a microphone and they're yelling a big question mark at the politician. And then behind the press is all the people.
Yep.
And then she goes, that was then, this is today. The politician is standing there. The reporter now, the journalist, is now facing all the people with the microphone,
absolutely
magnifying what the politician is saying. And so the press, and Alex Berenson just today wrote a Substack article about how the press has not done its job. And so it's a fascinating world. One quick thing, and this just neither of us go down the rabbit hole. I think we look at things very we are questioning
pragmatically.
But we hear this thing called the deep state, and I'm going to tell you I believe in the deep state, but it probably isn't the same deep state that some people talk about. What I believe is that bureaucracy has become so powerful and big, and these are lifelong employees in these bureaucracies who have incentives to gain more power, to get more budgets, to get bigger budgets, to control the people that fall under their agencies. It's human nature. But what's giving them all this power is all the money and the regulations that we have built up over the years. So the deep state is just a result of us letting the government grow.
Absolutely.
It's not George Washington's nephew who got cut out of the family will and joined up with
Right.
with Abraham Lincoln's second cousin who also was cut out of the will. And they're trying to, steal the world from everybody. That's what I think about the Trilateral Commission. It's like these people that control the whole world. No, these are just bureaucrats who, through their own self-interest, make government bigger and more powerful and more intrusive than it should be.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, what tends to happen for the common, average middle class American and middle class global citizen, which is, the entire middle class globally is under attack right now, as we both, I think, would agree. I think
Right.
when they see that lack of transparency, and then they start to see names like Rockefeller, Gates,
Right.
Bezos, Buffett. I'll use the guy who I think personifies evil, quite honestly, is George Soros. When you hear those names and there are all these secretive meetings that seem very clandestine on the surface, they're going to draw their own conclusions. And that's where that fundamental lack of transparency becomes problematic
Totally.
for the average citizen.
Totally agree.
And I think
if we had a smaller government, I'm going to repeat this probably 5 times today. If we had a smaller government, these problems would be minimal. And just as a quick aside, people don't realize how much government has grown. Government runs around calling everybody greedy. So today it's the meat packers that are greedy. Well, government, now I exclude defense, not because I'm trying to hide anything, but just to get to the core of government, the non-defense part of government. In 1930, it was 2.5% of GDP. Today, it's 27% of GDP.
Staggering.
Yeah, if you do the math, that means government has grown 10 times faster than the economy over the last 90 years.
Yep.
They're the most greedy institution on the face of the earth, by far, is government.
It's funny, when you mentioned that previously, and I thought about that, and you try and extrapolate exactly how did that happen. And I don't believe that it's necessarily a conscious effort. Well, on the left, we could certainly say it's a conscious effort to grow government and have a more intrusive role in our lives as individuals, certainly from the left. But you raised the point that Democrats and Republicans alike have watched this happen. And I think it becomes a byproduct of a lot of the pork that goes into the budget, a lot of the pet projects. We talked about a certain senator, I'm not going to name him, whose vote, I believe, was swayed at the very end because of a certain amendment that was made to a bill that provided a significant level of funding to something that his wife was involved with. Those are the kinds of things that happen. And because they are happening on a compound level at such a high altitude, I think that's where it ends up happening. It's not one simple thing. It's a compound effect over time.
I totally agree. And then, Sandy, I mean, we don't have enough time to, there's been books and books and books written on these kinds of things, but why is it that government, everybody wants to grow. If you start a business, you want to grow. If you want more customers, you want to please more people. Well, government's in a sense no different. And I wish they were, but they aren't. And so oftentimes we hear people go, well, you're there, you just got to get something done. You have to do something. And people start believing that government can fix all the world's problems. And, we look at COVID today and we haven't fixed it. And yet government keeps telling us that, this will fix it. This will fix it. Education keeps getting worse and worse and worse. We've spent $25 trillion on the Great Society kind of welfare programs. $25 trillion.
Staggering.
And we're now looking at fifth, sixth, seventh generation welfare recipients. Yeah. I mean, I believe we are brother's keeper. However, we're doing it wrong. And in fact, we're making things worse, not better. And that's where it becomes like a dog chasing its tail, because the government grows and they claim they're going to fix a problem. They make the problem worse. And their answer is to just grow the government even more. And Republicans have done this. Democrats have done this. the 20 years of the last 90 that I just mentioned that was different was Reagan and then Clinton.
Right.
And
with an exception in the middle. I think we
right,
both
yeah,
agree.
Bush in the middle.
Bush one
Exactly.
was a disaster in terms of presidency
Totally.
economically. And it's funny because he was lionized and revered, and listen, a war hero, and I believe a good American, but boy, what a atrocious 4-year period that was economically for this country.
Right. And by the way, just to go back to this Great Reset, politicians aren't going to use that phrase. I mean, Klaus Schwab may, but they use Build Back Better, which if you think about, the phrase isn't that much, it's different words.
Not just the United States either, Brian. I mean, you have Boris Johnson referencing Build Back Better, the Premier of Australia, right? We're all using the term.
Yeah, exactly. So they have found that term to be better than the Great Reset for whatever reason. I'm sure they market it and do test groups and all of that kind of stuff. But it's all the same. It is the Great Reset agenda: climate change, inequality. I mean, if you listen to AOC, she says that the violation of indigenous rights in America is what led to climate change. And really, again, this is not a conspiracy. I'm not going to say it's code, but it's her way of saying capitalism causes climate problems.
100%.
Capitalism causes inequality. The minute the settlers overran the Indians, the world went to heck. And that's their model, their mantra of what's wrong with the American society.
100%. Let's digress for a second. We were talking before about the fact that there's nothing new under the sun. This is really recycled Marxism, communism in at its core.
Right.
And you talk about one of the great influences on you, in von Mises. Talk a little bit about Ludwig von Mises, the book he wrote, Socialism, and let's talk to the audience a little bit about things that you have taken from that book and from von Mises, in total.
Yeah. So just this is a great spot to just say I have been an avid reader my whole entire life, and you can, speaking of rabbit holes, people can go down rabbit holes of certain kinds of books, but we really need to broaden our horizon. So my life changed. I was a college kid, University of Montana. We were not a conservative school. It was no Hillsdale. I was more on the conservative side than most of my peers. But when I got to the Harris Bank, that's where I started in Chicago. The library, they were going to shut down. They had a big library. Boy, banking was good back then. In at 9, out at 3, have a library of your own.
That was before TD Bank and retail banking. Yes.
Yes, exactly. And they had a library, and one of the books there was Friedrich Hayek's book, Road to Serfdom. That book changed my life. And then I said, well, who did he learn from? And that's when I found out Ludwig von Mises, they're both Austrians, taught Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize, so did Milton Friedman. The three of those people, and I've read just about any word they've ever written. I even dig through old bookstores and found speeches by Mises to Mont Pelerin, et cetera. Anyway, but his book Socialism, I went there when Larry Arnn asked me to speak at Hillsdale because Mises is able to go to the root of things. And so this is why you brought this up. Mises talks about this phrase called having, and we'll translate it to our world today, it's ownership. All right. He was always really specific with words, but I'll just say ownership. So how do you own something? And if we go back to the very beginning of mankind, if you will, there was only two ways to own something: be the first one to get there and claim it, or steal it, all right, from somebody who already had it. And so over hundreds, thousands of years, everything in the world was stolen. Violence was how resources were redistributed. Now, I could argue there were settlers in the U.S. who weren't violent. they just moved in and the Indians moved out, others who were violent. But the bottom line is the Indians were here first. I have no doubt about it. And then the settlers came in, and the ownership was changed.
Mm-hmm.
Even though Indians, I don't think, really had the same idea of ownership as the West did. But so the whole point of Mises saying this was that violence was how things were redistributed, how assets were owned, how things were had.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't like violence. Like, human beings forever and ever have always never wanted to have violence. So what we have tried to do over the millennia is put in law to stop the violence.
Yep.
And so I bring up Moses coming down from the mountain, and he's got the 10 Commandments, and one of them is thou shalt not steal. All right. Then, I mean, and that wasn't the first attempt, because other people had laws before that, but thou shalt not steal. And why? Because stealing is violence. It's wrong. All right. And then we, we're fast forwarding through history. We had the Magna Carta, which finally gave peasants and serfs rights relative to kings and the dukes and the earls. Then we came up with the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I believe those are the pinnacle of mankind's thought about how to put law in and stop the violence, because that's what we're after, is peace. Now, what's interesting is how many people look back at that history and go, oh, well, law, it just legalized violence. Because unless you put the law in on day one of mankind, and by the way, nobody would have owned anything anyway at that point, because nobody claimed anything yet. Mm-hmm. So it's if you think about this, it's artificial. It's always artificial. If the law went in 1776, if the law went in 1749, if the law went in 1849, the ownership would have been different over all of those. The question is not whether it was fair at that moment. The question is, here we are over 200 years later, and has that made things fair? And so my belief is that especially if you look at the U.S., Sam Walton was milking his family's cow, went to the service during World War II, and became, started a five and dime and became a billionaire, changed the retail industry. Mm-hmm. Jeff Bezos changed it again. Oprah Winfrey changed daytime TV, became a billionaire. So each one of them, because the law was there, allowing them to benefit from their hard work, changed, reimagined, built back better the U.S. economy. It's different today because Oprah existed. And so what I would argue is that law gives people an opportunity to change the ownership through entrepreneurship, through the fire of invention, and we
Brian,
at the same time
you
we
speak
get rid of that
specifically
violence.
though, just to interrupt you speak very specifically about I believe it was, let me reference this right way, the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, all right, where you talk about, and Lincoln referenced it. You want to talk a little bit about what that is and why it's so important for people to remember and understand?
Sure. Abraham Lincoln was brilliant, and reading his speeches, I know the Gettysburg Address is famous, but he gave probably to 40 people, who knows, but this chat about how America became so great. I mean, even back then, people were wearing watches from Europe and spices from India, and he goes, how does all this happen? And he goes through, we had to invent a language, we had to invent the ability to write and share history. But he specifically puts one thing about the U.S. in there, and that's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8. It's the only time the word right is used in the Constitution. And what it does is it gives the right of ownership, of having, to a writer or an inventor. And so at that point, when Jeff Bezos comes up with one click, because of the Constitution, he has the right to own that. No one can steal it from him. And that clause right there is what allows America to create wealth. No longer is violence the way to get something. it's hard work, it's ingenuity, and
It's
it's
the
personal
fuel. You said it.
responsibility.
It's the fuel of self-interest. You quoted Lincoln, right? The fuel of
Right.
self-interest, which was in essence fired up the creative genius of the
Yeah,
country.
the way
Right?
the way Lincoln said is the fuel of interest to the fire. It added the fuel of interest, self-interest, to the fire of invention.
It's such
And
an
it's
eloquent way to put it. It's incredible.
yeah, yep. And gosh, why am I blanking on his first name? His last name's Novak. He's passed away now, but it was because of him that I found that essay by Lincoln. And he was a good Catholic and economic and political writer. But he pulled that out of Lincoln, and it was just brilliant. And so that's
Brian, excuse me, was that John Novak?
Yes, absolutely. And yep, perfect. And so what's interesting about this to me is that we know that when the Constitution was written, that blacks weren't allowed to vote, women weren't allowed to vote.
Right.
In many, now, by the way, these were all state laws at the time, but in many states, not all, blacks weren't allowed to own property.
Right.
This was wrong, like the wrong period, like no doubt about it. The great thing about the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights is that it, for the first time in the world, that was allowed to be changed, and we were able to move forward in a different and freer world. Because in a feudal world, that never would change. The Magna Carta was pretty good, but it wouldn't have happened there. And I know William Wilberforce was able to end slavery in the UK, but in the United States, we moved to emancipation, we moved to the civil rights. It was a lot of fighting, a lot of battle, but we got there. And so my whole point would be that the law, even though it codified a set of ownership that anybody could argue. By the way, if you put the law in on Thursday, somebody stole something on Wednesday.
Exactly.
So
Brian, why are most laws created in the first place? Because something predates it that was causal. Right. So
right, exactly. And so I don't want to beat all this up too much, but it's because Mises hits it on the head. And the question is do you want that law to keep making opportunity for people because they get the ownership of their own hard work, or do you want to go back and try to pierce the law with government power and redistribute assets? And I believe that, and economic science tells me that the more we try to redistribute, the more we undermine economic growth and opportunity for all Americans, or if you want to think of the world, every citizen of the world.
It's amazing because as I think through so many of the things that you shared so generously, and I thank you again, I think about the fact that you mentioned the word entrepreneurship, and you mentioned a couple of the world's greatest entrepreneurs in history. We can also talk about Musk because we talked about him yesterday. In my opinion, will go down, in my opinion, as the smartest person to walk the planet to date, for a number of different reasons. Pardon me. And you referenced yesterday, he'll end up being the founder of $2 trillion companies, which is just
right.
To have those words come out of your mouth are incredible.
Right.
But when we tie that to entrepreneurship, and you think back, literally millennium, where the entrepreneurs of historical times versus today, you talk about the Constitution providing the opportunity for everybody to have the opportunity to build or grow a business versus whether or not they were under the favor of the ruling party or the monarchy at the time. Historically, This is much different than what they were experiencing back then. And that's why it's so important for us to protect the Constitution and the Bill of Rights as we move forward, because it's under attack right now. We would both agree. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is you hear this phrase all the time, something on the order of democracies only last 200 years.
Right.
And I think the Tocqueville had something like that in there or whatever. But and we we kind of viscerally, with our knowledge of history, understand that Rome didn't last forever, Greece didn't last forever, the British pound fell. However, here's my point about this. There's only one democracy in the history of the world that has the U.S. Constitution as its governing document, and
Correct.
that one hasn't failed yet. And if I, deep down in, I'm an optimist. Deep down in, I'm a patriot. I described as being an Eagle Scout, all that. I believe our founders were able to craft a document that will let us outlast that statement. I hope I'm right.
The greatest black swan in history, correct?
Yes, exactly.
I thought that was perfectly put.
Yeah. Think about what, these black swans, things happen out of nowhere. Like all swans are white until you see a black one. Well, gosh, if you go back to the 1700s, I would be living at the same living standards as my father and grandfather, maybe a little bit better, but I would assume my kids are going to have about the same living standards as my grandfather. And then all of a sudden, in this late 1700s, there's this straight parabolic move in wealth. And to me, there are no coincidences like that. That was the power of the U.S. Constitution and the giving the right to inventors to own their invention, the fire of invention and the power of self-interest to create wealth. And so America is the greatest black swan. See, I actually call it a white swan because black connotes bad and black, white's good, black hat, white hat, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's the greatest black swan ever because no one could have anticipated that the United States would have done what it has done.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And, you also referenced there was a correlation between non-defense governmental spending and also I'll call it an exodus from spiritual and religious practice in this country. Right. Talk a little bit about that, because when you talk about ideas, I love the way you put it. You say the ideas they didn't come from you. Ideas come from divine intervention or a spiritual piece. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Sandy, I as you said, I've written 2 books. And so that means I've spent a lot of time sitting in front of the keypad, just trying to come up with a way to say things or something like that. And I don't even know if I should tell this story about myself, but it's the way I think of the world. And that is, all of a sudden I'll see, I'll come up with an idea. An idea will pop into my brain, and man, it just flows on the keyboard. It works out great. It fits the point I want to make perfectly. And I do what those running backs do in the end zone, and as I'm like, thank you, Lord, because I don't believe ideas come from me. They're manna from heaven. Mm-hmm. All right. So then let's transfer that. This is one of the things that worries me the most about the U.S. and the globe today. Government spending, as we said, went from 2.5% of GDP to 27% of GDP. Tenfold increase in the size of government. Well, every dime the government spends comes from the private sector. So if government is 10% of the economy, then that's like putting 10 people in the wagon.
Yep.
And then the other 90 people have to pay for it, have to pull the wagon. Well, that was 1935. We get to 1980, now government is 17% of the economy, and we have 17 people in the wagon, and there are 83 people pulling. So which one of those wagons goes faster? 83 pulling 17 or 90 pulling 10. Well, the more people you have in the wagon, the fewer people pulling, the slower you grow. Mm-hmm. And now today we're at 27% of GDP, which is a massive increase. So now we have over 25%, 27% of the economy in the wagon. And that means only 73% are pulling, 73 are pulling. And but I made a joke in my speech. I'm like, of those 73, 13 work for the government. So we probably ought to put them in the wagon too. Right. But nonetheless, so the whole point I'm getting to is that the more people we put in the wagon, the bigger we grow government, the harder it is to pull the wagon, the slower we grow. And a couple of stats, between 1980 and 2000, that was Reagan and Clinton with the Bush and one in the middle. The U.S. economy grew 3.4% a year, real GDP. That's pretty rapid compared to history. Since 2000, it's been 1.7. So we've cut our growth in half as we've made the wagon harder to pull. We have all these great technologies. Everyone pulling the wagon is stronger, if you will, more productive than they were 40 years ago, but we're still unable to pull the wagon very fast. And so there are a lot of conservatives who I hear all the time. They complain about how hard it is to pull the wagon, how we only have 1.7% growth, how, that there are people with their, it's like they're always kind of complaining about that. And I get that because it's true. But I believe there's a deeper issue going on here. And that is when God put us here on earth in his image. We're creators. We are supposed to serve our fellow man. And I also believe that we're our brother's keepers. So the question is, how many of our brothers and sisters need to be kept? Because we know there are people that absolutely need our help. All right, we know that. And the question I always have is, how many out of every 100 people in the world or in the United States, how many of those people absolutely can't do it on their own? They're for any reason whatsoever. And I would argue that number is probably, let's call it 5. I think that's too many, 5 out of 100, but let's just call it 5. Well, right now we have 27 people in the wagon.
Yep.
That means there's 22 people that shouldn't be there. And if you allow yourself to sit in a wagon, in other words, receive entitlements from other people, when you shouldn't be in the wagon, then what happens is your soul starts to die. And that's the thing that bothers me the most. And you go back in history, in pre-French Revolution in the UK, it was gin. Everybody drank gin. Everybody was drunk all the time. In Soviet Russia, it was vodka. In the US, we have an opioid problem. We have, there are people doing drugs all over the place. And I believe those are signs that say there's part of the society's soul is dying. And so the only way to fix that is to get people out of the wagon. The problem is the more people count on government, and this was the chart that I used. You go back pre-1960, and there have been polls done. Pew Research did the poll where they ask people every year, and they've been doing it for almost 100 years. Are you a member of a church or a synagogue? And 70 plus 72, 73, 74% of people would say yes, they're a member of a church and a synagogue. Well, that number today is now down to 47. And this breaks my heart. Not because you have to be a member of a church, but what I believe it shows a sign of is that people are now believing in government more than they believe in God. Their higher power is now government. And as a result, I think that's the root of a lot of our society's problems today.
I couldn't agree more with you, Brian. And I tell you that when I think about over the course of the last 40 years to 50 years, and I go right to Saul Alinsky, and I go to Rules for Radicals, and I go to that whole crew and what they've been able to do, in my opinion, in terms of infiltration of the education system and the bureaucracy of the federal government. And that's why we see what we've seen over the course of the last 3 to 5 years, most specifically, and really more glaring, because I think that they've grown in their braveness to just do what they want to do, whereas they were hiding some of their actions year over year preceding the last 3 to 5 years. I almost look at, you want to talk about a black swan. I mean, Trump's presidency, is looked at by a lot of people as a black swan. But for those that were paying attention, it was no surprise. for those that were really paying attention, was no surprise. He spoke to a very underserved portion of the population, and probably that 40 some odd percent of the people that we're talking about here today. And that doesn't mean the evangelical Christians alone. It means anybody that had some level of spirituality in their life, some level of religious connection. And I believe that, to your point, where government replaces the quote unquote religion in your life, it's what they can't provide is a sense of community, is a sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself. You become a ward of the state versus a member of a community that's built, ideally, is built around love and caring for your fellow human beings, you know? And so I think that is part of the great ill, to your point, of what we're seeing here today. You talked about,
you know what, Sandy, let me just interrupt one quick second. Sure. There are really four entities, institutions, if you will. This is the way I look at it in society. There's government, and it has a role. All right. I am not an anarchist by far. Government has a role. There are churches and community groups. Doesn't have to be. I'm not trying to be overly religious here. You know, have God save you, whatever. That's up to you. That there are churches, there are families, and there are individuals. And each one of those, in the Bible, it actually talks about the responsibility of each one of those. But you don't even have to go to the Bible. You just have to think, what should be the responsibility of each of those groups? And government has slowly, but it used to be that churches took care of the poorest among us. They're the ones that opened orphanages. They're the ones that had soup kitchens. And government has slowly but surely taken over the role of the church, you know, whether they did it because of the rules were radical or just because they just, you know, people think it's more fair, or, you know, it might be good intentions gone bad, but nonetheless they did. Then now they're, you know, in Virginia, they want to take over the role of the family, which is, you know, this is one of the reasons why Glenn Youngkin won that election, because people were so mad at the schools telling them that their kids, the parents didn't have a role in teaching their kids. And then with the individual, that's the person that's sitting in the wagon that's not taking personal responsibility. And so we need to get back to some kind of more normal distribution of responsibilities between the government, between the church and the community, between the family and the individual. And this may seem weird, but the only way to do that is cut the size of government. And I don't know.
I don't think that's weird at all, Brian. I think therein lies the great challenge for us, right? Where is the next Ronald Reagan, right? Where is that person, you know, in our country right now that's going to be willing to stand up and truly fight? You know, again, love or hate Trump, there were a lot of things that he did to reduce the size of government that I agreed with. You know, especially in terms of cutting through a lot of the bureaucratic red tape and, you know, his position of eliminating a certain number of laws, et cetera, for everyone that they put on the books. They took 3 or 4 off the books. And I think he was very successful in that regard. But I want to go back to the deeper issue, which is there's that shift of the public thinking that they can get better care from their government than they can from their spiritual community. And I think that is a byproduct of there's been an erosion of trust over the course of the last few decades. And we can talk about any religion. It really makes no difference. Okay. And I don't know if you're familiar with Neil Howe and William Strauss and their work.
I am not. I'm sorry.
So they wrote a wonderful book called Generations. I recommend Generations to not everybody, to be honest with you. It's a book that I would highly recommend you pick up. It's an incredible read. Generations by William Strauss and Neil Howe. Neil Howe works with Hedgeye, and he's an economist, a socioeconomist as well. He also wrote a book called The 13th Generation and the Fourth Turning. The reason I reference it is because he talks about the erosion of trust in these civic authorities and civic organizations that are out there, and government specifically. And I think that I think of it as like a pool of water, and the trust is the pool of water, and it keeps washing back and forth, and the mix of trust, or percentage of trust, if you will, you know, changes with the times. I think we're ripe. And you mentioned the word revival in your speech. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I see that happening at a very grassroots level. My big question, and I think I'm going to say this to you, the big question is there enough time left for us to reverse the tide, if you will, knowing that we're battling, I would say, tools and resources that we have not seen before in the form of big data, social media, and their partnerships with global governments around the world.
Right.
Like, how do we fight that as individual Americans, as small business owners? What can those folks do to push back and really rediscover what you call the real answer, which is freedom, America, in the first place?
Right. Yeah, that is the answer. I think I finished off my talk by saying we need Hillsdale. We need more Hillsdales. And revivals happen when people hit bottom, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to be the historian of record here or anything like that, and I can't go back and tell us all the different histories of every revival, every like the U.S. throughout Britain. We ended up having the revolution. I wouldn't call for a revolution, but we need we need individuals.
I like the revival
to take
better.
back.
Yeah,
me too. And so, but I think partly, I'm hoping that what we're doing is we're seeing it happen now. One of the things about the internet era, social media, it has benefits and it has costs, and we could talk about those. I think a lot of the issues, like where people get so angry about things, it is a lot driven by social media. It's a loss of personal faith. I do agree with all of that, but I also come back and it's just the raw size of the government.
Yep.
And that's what we need to change. So are people willing to take more responsibility? And it's kind of fascinating because I think we're kind of getting to the end of people's willingness to put up with what government's doing with the pandemic. Although I look at Australia and New Zealand, and people are apparently, they're fighting back in some cases, but they're willingly going to these camps for 14 days. And it's all about trying to save myself. I'm really weirded out by some of this, but the way I look at the polls today, there's something going on in America. And by the way, Republicans, they got a lot to prove to me, because so far they have been part of this growth in government. So just having Republicans win doesn't mean anything like necessary. They have to do the right things when they get there.
Yeah, well, at the risk of naming, a sitting U.S. Senator, Mitt Romney's a Republican. And, makes me a little bit nervous. I got to be honest with you.
Exactly.
But to that point, I'm weirded out by what's going on in Australia as well. I don't know if you saw what happened with Djokovic, the tennis player, yesterday.
I did.
Being detained. He was detained for like over 7 hours. And they ultimately said you can't come into the country. What has happened over there is absolutely seismic in terms of when you think about the global implications. And I almost look at it as the petri dish for the Great Reset, where they're seeing how far can they push, a population of a country into, obedience and unquestioned obedience. I don't know that everybody is abiding by these government mandates and this authoritarian lockdown that you see over there, because I see enough on social media. And to your point about social media, Brian, it's an amplification of both good and bad. That's all it really is. It's the megaphone for folks. So it makes a perspective seem or appear bigger than it maybe really is, right? It does have the possibility, or it does have the potential to create wildfire like events. Look at what happened in Egypt. Obviously, the Arab Spring is a perfect example. But I agree with you. I think, there is an opportunity for us here right now to stop it, to take it back. There is definitely a palpable undercurrent in this country right now of frustration on the part of the individual citizen. And I see the conflict, and you tell me if you see the same thing. I see the conflict from citizen to citizen, where that's where the division comes in. And that's what troubles me the most, is people that were friends for decades and have a difference of opinion on one issue that quite honestly, politicians have turned into life and death. We can, I think, arguably say right now, dying from COVID and dying of COVID are two different things. Significantly different things. They've been completely misrepresented by the media, in my opinion. And so it's created this fear. You talked about the maskless society. Like, you don't like the mask up routine, nor do I. I think it's crazy.
Right.
It dehumanizes, as you said. Talk a little bit about that. You were at Hillsdale. You talked about that.
Yeah, I did. I mean, that's where we've gone. We are, you know, I still, I don't know if I will in the rest of my life understand why we've done some of the things we do, other than it's just out of pure fear. But these masks, especially on kids, how do you learn to speak when you can't see the lips of your teacher move?
Mhm.
Like, and I'm talking 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids. This is it. And also, when you put a mask on, you don't walk by your neighbor. You walk by a bundle of germs.
Yep.
That's not your neighbor who, you know, it's somebody that's going to infect you and you're going to die. And so by the way, a lot of this started back in the subprime crisis. I don't know if you remember this, but they used to, I mean, I know you remember the subprime crisis.
I know where you're going.
This one particular part where they would say, if you have some, you know, loser in your neighborhood who got a subprime loan and now his house is down or her house is down 40%, it's going to drag so now you hate your neighbor, and because they dragged your house price down. And so now you look at your neighbor as a bundle of germs. And so what we're doing is, you know, to go back to that, we have government, we have the church, or the community, we have the family, and we have the individual, and we're putting wedges in all of those.
Yeah.
The one good thing, Sandy, I could say about this is the internet age, the social media, everything moves faster.
Yeah.
So I believe if we were 40 years ago right now, 50 years ago right now, that the Fed could have printed all this money, but we wouldn't have seen inflation already at 7%. We wouldn't have seen gas price, you know, oil prices up to 80 so quickly. Yep. I get it. We're locking down. We have supply chain issues, all that. But what in internet time, everything moves faster. Mm-hmm. So you know, they make a bad mistake in policy, and it shows up right away. And the other thing,
impossible to hide from it too.
Right. And, you know, there's just it's kind of off subject a little bit, but Reagan, they called Reagan the Teflon president.
Yep.
Because nothing stuck to him. All right. You know, and what that really meant is I wish that this would stick to him, but nobody cares because everybody's happy. Because when you follow good policies, you get higher incomes, you get lower inflation, you get more growth, you get more opportunity, you get less pain in society, everything's easier, life is easier, life is getting better. When you follow bad policies, things get bad, and today they get bad really quickly. Yep. And so I've had people say, well, Reagan was the Teflon president. That means Joe Biden is the cast iron skillet president, because everything sticks to him. And that seems to be what's happening now. I hope that what people realize is that the pain they're feeling, high gas prices, high food prices, shortage of cars, all of those things, those pains, they realize they came from government. Sometimes I worry that we don't know that, and that's where the Republicans come in. They have to explain this, but to me, so far, they're not doing a very good job of that.
Brian, I read a book years ago called The Panama Papers, and it really stung me because it was the first red pill moment of my life, to be completely honest with you. I said, wow, you know, and by the way, a few of them are still sitting senators in Congress today who were flat out named in the book. That's the part that I think, you know, really troubles me the most, is that when you speak about, and I'll speak specifically about Republicans, but we talk about any political party at this point, whether independent, Democrat or Republican, they are so busy with their hands out looking for what they can take in, that they're not busy doing the work that they're supposed to be doing of the federal government, right? So, and I think, you know, we alluded to that before, and how it has a compound effect. I don't know who our saving graces will be. You talk about the two senators, Manchin and Sinema, you know, playing a role. You talk about, I think you talked about the Schechter brothers as well, way back when with FDR, right?
Yeah. Yeah, people don't. That's just a little known story. But way back in the Great Depression,
But
FDR
something people
put
should
that.
know.
Yeah, he put that massive regulatory apparatus in place because they were going to. It's like Australia today, shutting down. We're going to control the virus. He was going to control the economy. And we hear today, I mean, Joe Biden's going to control the meat producers and the oil production. And like, this is a tendency of politicians throughout history and life. But anyway, one of the things that regulatory rule did was it used to go in and you went into to buy a chicken and the Schechter brothers sold chickens and you would pick out the one you wanted. Well, the government said, that's not right. We have to do this randomly. Like, it's the craziest rule ever. I laugh when I hear about it. And so the chickens have to be in the back room and then they have to, close their eyes and pick one, like whatever. The Schechter brothers said, this is ridiculous. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court. They were basically illiterate immigrants to the United States, and they won. And that shut down FDR's regulatory apparatus. By the way, that's why he threatened to pack the court, the Supreme Court back in the 30s. It was all because of these two brothers. So I'm like, hey, if the Schechter brothers can do it, maybe Manchin and Sinema can do it as well. Maybe I'm well wishing.
I don't know, but I said it to you yesterday. I'm a little uneasy placing the fate of the United States in the hands of two sitting senators. I don't have a lot of faith in that body at this point, to be honest with you. There's a few there that I believe are there for the right reasons, for the most part.
Right.
The altruism in me wants to believe that, but it brings me to another question. When we talk about the Supreme Court, and I think when we look back, 5, 10, 20 years from now on the 3 appointments to the Supreme Court that Trump did manage to get done, and all by virtue constitutionalists, I think would be a good way to describe virtually all 3 of them. Would you agree?
Yeah, I totally would agree. And like I said before, this country hasn't failed yet, and we have the Constitution. As long, I think, as we protect it, the rule of law, the right of individuals to retain the benefits of their inventions, their writings, I don't believe we're going to fail. I think our founding fathers knew exactly what they were doing, and it's going to work. I can also see that we don't follow that path. That I think the Supreme Court will be good in terms of its decisions. I'm just hoping voters actually, one of the things that I have believed in forever and ever and ever, and I know you probably have too, and lots of the people viewing this, is school vouchers. We need choice. Like, just today, I haven't done the tweet yet, but just today, President Biden comes out and he goes, the reason meat prices are so high is we don't have enough competition. There's only 4 meat producers. And I'm like, so my tweet is going to be something along the lines of, there's 4 meat producers, 2 political parties, and 1 Chicago public school system. Which one doesn't have enough competition?
Right.
And so I actually think that we're seeing more and more people homeschooling, demand for private schools is through the roof right now. Not everybody can afford that, but the pressure for more charter schools is growing each and every day. That's one of the key things that could change our world in the years ahead. It's the young that have to be allowed to learn about Western civilization, about the virtues of Aristotle, about how to live a good life, responsibility. And we don't teach that anymore. And I think we will if we can get more vouchers, more choice in the education system.
I couldn't agree with you more. I am a 1985 graduate of Bergen Catholic High School in Oradell, New Jersey. I'm giving them a shout out right now. My son followed in my footsteps years later. He's a 2020 graduate of the school. It was not a small investment for my wife and I to enroll my son there and pay for it over the 4 years that he was there. Well over $100,000 investment, plus the taxes that I paid in New Jersey
Right.
for the school that he wasn't even going to.
Right.
And my daughter goes to public school. It's a wonderful public school. It's a very highly rated educational facility with great teachers. But there is an element in the school which I am not entirely comfortable with, to be honest with you.
Right.
Not from a pure education perspective, but from a little bit of the indoctrination piece, which we spoke about before. Right. But I agree with you. You know, we have to be, just like anything else out there, we have to be held accountable for the performance of the product that we are creating. And the product is the student that ends up graduating from these institutions. You know, I don't agree with Richard Dreyfuss 100% politically, I'm sure. But, you know, Richard Dreyfuss, the actor, he's got an initiative out there called the Dreyfuss Civics Initiative, which, you know, what he wanted to do or wants to do is reintroduce and refocus on teaching civics at the high school level. And boy, is he spot on. We may not agree politically, but he is right on the money there. We have lost our way in the education system in terms of teaching people what's important and what's actually true, in my opinion. You know,
exactly. You know, one of the things that I have said in many talks and you know, at First Trust, we have a lot of people that are 30 and 40 years old, and I'm like, if you're not over 50, if you're not over 50, you don't remember viscerally the inflation of the 70s. You may have read about it, but you haven't lived it, and that doesn't mean I'm not trying to be an old fogey, but one of the things that led to Reagan, and Volcker was his sidekick, if you will. They pulled the levers the right way to get growth up, inflation down. One of the reasons that we ended up with Reagan, and one of the reasons Carter was a one-term president, was the inflation. And so if that inflation can actually make people realize, man, government can really mess up my life, I don't want so much of it. And then you see it with the school system. You see it with people fed up with mandates and COVID policy and all of those things. We're setting up, in a sense, to find somebody like Reagan. I just don't know who it is, and I don't want to bet on a horse or say anybody, but we need somebody like that. No, the thing about Reagan. The difference between Reagan and Trump is that Reagan could take a position that was pretty radical and do it in a grandfatherly way. And President Trump, his kids love him. I know they do. Somewhere there is that grandfatherly, fatherly care and love, but it didn't come across to the American public. And where it did with Reagan. And so while I love Trump's policies, he didn't have Reagan's demeanor. And I don't know if he can develop it, if he can convince everybody that he's changed it, probably not. But we have to find someone who, and I don't want to replace Reagan or have a new Reagan. It needs to be somebody different.
Someone new, fresh ideas about smaller government and how to get there.
And proper delivery.
Well,
proper delivery.
I'm going to say this to you about Trump because I've taken time to study. I'll call his demeanor, but it's not really demeanor that I was studying. I look at where he comes from. This is a kid that was born and raised in Queens who fought his way. Now you could talk about the father and the $10 million seed money all day long. If you didn't grow up in Queens, you're not going to understand what I'm talking about right now. Where did Ronald Reagan grow up? He grew up in California, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Much different world than growing up on the streets of Queens in what I would consider to be a bloody knuckled real estate market, commercial real estate market. That guy fought every single day to survive. As much as it sounds weird to say about a billionaire, he wasn't a billionaire when he was in it. He was very well off. He was upper middle class. There's no doubt. The reason why he is so gruff and he is so acerbic at times is because that was the only language that was understood, and that was the currency of that Manhattan real estate market back then, and Queens for God's sakes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when you put together the construction companies, the families that you had to do business with,
100%.
bureaucrats that you had to do business with, it was all rough and tumble. Totally agree.
Absolutely.
You know what I used to say?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I used to describe it. I thought he was going to win the whole entire time, and one of my ways of saying that was, look, when he's negotiating with somebody, I can just imagine the other side going, look, sell him the building at that price. I don't ever want to be in a room with him again.
Yeah.
And in a way, I feel like that's what the voters did. And then they're like, okay, I can't do it again. And that's what I think happened.
That's what I hope happened, Brian. I got to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I hope happened, because if it's the alternative, quite honestly, then then I have fears that we can't even talk about right now, for fear of being labeled conspiracy theorists. But I really do hope that is the case, because I think that Washington spit him out like poison, because he stuck his fist right into the spokes of the financial machine that was spinning at a pretty good clip for decades.
Well, that's the biggest problem with trying to cut the size of government, is that you're reversing decades and decades and decades and decades of bureaucrats, growth and self-interest and building up and power. Yep. And that's where I come back to, I know even saying the phrase deep state is like weird, but
it's not anymore. I think it's really, it's not weird anymore. I think it's so mainstream because people have now seen and felt it.
Right. But I don't think it's some secret cabal.
No.
It's like, how do you get a banana into your grocery store? Well, you get the banana because somebody has to grow it, ship it, truck it, put it on the, pick it, clean it, unpack it, like all that stuff. Okay. Well, how do you get a regulation implemented? Well, there's a million bureaucrats, and they're all working together, and it's the same. It's not competitive like the banana industry or the grocery stores, but it's not a cabal. It's not like they call each other up at night going, here's what we're going to do. They literally compete against each other for political power. I told you, I worked in DC for 2 years. Yep. The first day I was there, the very first day, walking down the hall with one of my future workmates, new workmate, and they go, what's your next job? And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, every 2 years we all change jobs around here. What's your next one?
Yep.
And I'm like, I haven't even done this one yet.
Yep.
Like, it was so out of the realm of reality to me that I'm like, that's the way people think here. And it is. They're like, who do I have to step on? What do I have to do? How do I gain more power to get the next better job? And every 2 years, I'm going to work on that. And so that's the self-interest of these bureaucrats. Mm-hmm. And Republicans have all kinds of ideas, like or conservatives have all kinds of libertarians. Like, let's move the Department of Education to Omaha, and get it out of DC. And I'm like, okay, that's fine, but that's I don't know how we do it, but we have to, the penny plan. We're going to cut 1 penny out of every dollar of spending for the next 3 years. Okay. That's easier to sell than a big cut to government, mm-hmm. but so far nobody's been able to do it. And
the reason why, Brian, the reason is because they'd rather look at adding just another 2 or 3 pennies on top of what we're already spending, because it's not going to make that much of a difference. You follow me?
Right.
And so it just compounds. You know the deal. It just compounds over time, sadly. The amazing part to me is there's never a recession in Washington, D.C. or any state capital for that matter.
Right.
The business of government is good business. If you're in it.
It's booming. Yeah, they've grown 10 times fast. I've been wanting to go back and look at the market cap of Berkshire Hathaway versus the government, and I bet you they're not that much different. Government has grown 10 times faster than the economy over the last 90 years. That number right there just blows my mind, and that's what has to change.
It's staggering.
And the answer to all of this is freedom, and it was why we're the black swan, why we've been able to create so much wealth. We have made, like politics these days has made everybody angry toward each other. But I still believe one of the key reasons for that is that government is so big. You think about, just because you get the most number of votes in a congressional district doesn't mean you're a COVID expert. Doesn't mean you should have 535th vote
Amen.
for a $4.5 trillion budget. And if that budget was only $1 trillion, and I know that's a pipe dream, but it wouldn't be that, people wouldn't be angry about that as much anymore. Government is so big, the power that comes with controlling pieces of it is so great that people are willing to go to the mattresses to fight for that power.
Yes.
And it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah, and I could not agree with you more. So I know we have two other questions that we want to ask you before we wrap. This has been beyond fascinating and enjoyable for me. I want to thank you, Brian, because you've been generous
Brian.
with your time and your intellect.
Thanks, Ron.
And as I said to you, I think the message that you bring, anything that we can do to continue to promote and amplify that message, I think will help this country. And I mean that sincerely. I don't want to make you uncomfortable because I know you're not a guy that wants to talk about himself. But Brian, I think we need more Brian Wesburys out there delivering more visual speeches, like getting out there so people can see and hear common sense approach to some really big, complex problems that we're facing. I know Ron had asked. I'm going to ask the first question. I'm going to let Ron ask the closing question because I think it's important. Because you talk about, when you think about things, you say you break it down into two parts: the next 12 months and then after that.
Right.
And so I'm going to let Ron ask the final question because it speaks right to how you think about things. I think it's important, but I'll ask this question real quickly because I think it begs an answer from somebody who's got an opinion who I completely respect. Do we see this sitting president finish his term, or do you think we're going to see a change in the Oval Office before he hits his 4 years? I'm curious.
Yeah, I actually think he's going to finish it out. If he's made it this far, I know what everybody says about him. I've seen gaffes. I've seen gaffes from a lot of people in government before, but I think he makes it. And so it may or may not be good for the Democrats that he does, but I actually think he will make it to the end of the term.
Interesting.
I don't think he's going to run again. I do not.
I agree with you. I think I didn't think he was a winning candidate last go around, to be completely honest with you. And we can talk about that until the cows come home. But Ron has another, it's his question. It was a great provocative question. I want him to hit you with it.
All right.
And Brian, first and foremost, thank you. You've been gracious with your time. And I have taken some copious notes over here as we've had this conversation.
Hashtag WTSD, Brian.
Hashtag WTSD.
We write that down.
All of it, always. You made a career out of clearly deconstructing and analyzing data and then really applying the philosophy that has influenced you from that socioeconomic perspective. How would you see, this affecting society really over the next 6 to 12 months? Like, what are the bigger picture pieces maybe that people can take away from this conversation and then more importantly maybe apply, but how do you really see it affecting first and foremost society in the next 6 to 12?
Yeah, this thank you, Ron. This is good. Actually, to go back to where you just started, I believe the only way to analyze an economy, I'll just talk about economics, is to have a model, a worldview, a frame of reference, because what that allows me to do is to take information that I get and realize very quickly whether it's important to the model or not important to the model. And so, the way when I talk to people that are supply siders, that are Misesians, Hayekians, Friedmanites, I'm like, okay, you got the model. And so, because I can tell, I've been living with it so long that that's it. So then you don't get all, carried away by extraneous things. The second thing I would say is that what I think, because of the Constitution, because of the right to own, because of technology, we have more opportunity today then even in the midst of all this craziness and all this mess, we have more opportunity today than ever before. There's more job openings than I ever have seen in the history of the economy. There are so many small businesses that didn't survive that need to be replaced. Entrepreneurship. I think people have opportunity today. It's funny. I'll close it off with this. I know a lot of financial advisors. I work with a ton of them, thousands and thousands over my years. The ones that started in 1981, the ones that started in 2008, the world was falling apart, and yet they were able to get a toehold in the middle of that, and then grow with America after it. They're some of the most successful and happiest people I know. And so there's never a bad time. And in fact, when there's blood in the streets, sometimes it's the best time. So, rock on.
I love it.
Yeah, no, totally. And agree with that totally, Brian, because, they say that when there is, as you said, blood in the streets, or when things are at a low, just kind of like stock markets, people say, well, buy low and sell high, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right,
people
exactly.
have to just recognize that there is this tremendous opportunity if they only go out to find the information and make sure it's viable and accurate and relevant, and then go ahead and go after what it is you might want to build and look for where those burning issues may lie. And then if it's something that you're passionate about, which Sandy and I always talk about, you will be successful because you're going to work through those more difficult times. So I totally agree.
That's exactly. And by working through them, you just get stronger, more powerful, better, smarter, faster, and 10, 15 years and now from, I was always amazed when I was a younger guy in jobs. I would take a problem to my boss and he had an answer in like 42 seconds. And I'm like, how did you know that? And now I get to wow the younger guys and gals that work for me, because they bring me a problem. I'm like, that's easy. And I'm not trying to say I'm wise. I'm just old and I've lived through a lot.
There's no substitute for experience, Brian. I mean, it's an expensive way to learn things very often, but there's no substitute for it.
None. And the only way to get it is to stick to it.
Well, chapter 9 of the book Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill is entitled Persistence. And man, if the country's in need of one thing right now, it is the ability to persist and persevere and think for ourselves, as individuals. And so I can't thank you enough for providing our audience with insights and content that I could have only dreamt of prior to this conversation. I thank you again for your generosity and for being willing to just answer a simple Instagram message that I sent to you and a LinkedIn message that I sent to you. It shows the power of social media for something good, for being able to provide a level of insight and intelligence that a lot of our audience probably wouldn't have had access to if we didn't have the opportunity to sit down with you today. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
Brian,
thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Ron.
How can they follow you? Where can our folks go to get more of Brian Wesbury?
I'm on @Wesbury with Twitter. So that's no T, WESBURY. And then my company is First. I work for a money management firm, First Trust Portfolios, and I'll say this slow. It's FT, First Trust, FTP LP, as in limited partnerships, .com. And if you go there, that's my blog. You can sign up to get videos. Anything we post, we just fire them out. And I promise, if you sign up for it, you will never be marketed. So we just send it out. So.
Well, I encourage everybody that's listening to go over there and sign up for the RSS feed for Brian's blog. I will do that the minute that we end over here. I also encourage you to go out and order his books. I've ordered 2 copies for Ron and I to enjoy as well. And don't forget to like, share, and comment for us on the podcast over here. This is Sandy Cerami, my main man, Ron Marvo, and our very special guest, Brian Wesbury, saying thank you for spending some time with us today on Icons, Influencers, and Inspirations. Have a great day, everybody. We're out. Great job, Brian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandy. That was fun.
Yeah,
That was
no,
fun.
it
It
was
went
a lot of
fast.
fun.
It was.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Went fast. Faster than I thought it would. So
That's when you're having
awesome.
fun, man.
Well, my friend, we've been on for
Yeah,
a little over an
exactly.
hour and a half. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's like I was looking at the clock. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. It's already been like an hour 10.
Brian,
I'm like,
I'm just
no,
gonna
I was.
admit
That's
this.
not. That wasn't a complaint. It was like that's how
No.
fast it went because it was fun.
Yeah,
So,
well, I have to confess, I said to Ron, I was a little anxious this morning because I've been so looking forward to having a conversation with you, and I didn't want to drag the intellect level down with you as part of this early podcast. But we could have
Never.
gone on for 3 hours. Ron will attest to this. Last night, I spent about 2 hours distilling down all of the notes that I had taken off of your speech because I've watched a number of times, all the things that were just in sync and alignment with what I'm seeing. And I had to distill it down to the 15 that we sent to you, but I had 51 at one point.
Yeah, he was like, Ron, I
said, we're going to keep this for 3 hours. I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
So I thank you.
We'll have
I
to
wish
say,
you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say we'd have to welcome in 2023. So anyway, if we would have done that, great. It was great being with you. They were great questions. Ron, thank you for your question at the end, and what a perfect way to end it.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you, Brian. You're a generous soul. I wish you nothing but safe travels, and we'll be in touch. We'd love to circle back with you in 6 months or so and do this again. Let's see where we're at and see if any lessons have been learned. But we'll be approaching the midterms at that point, so I think we're going to see some interesting things happening over the course of the next 6 months.
I totally agree. Love to be on with you again.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Brian.
All right.
God bless.
Yep.
God bless.
Take care.
Enjoy the
God
day.
bless you guys.
Thank you.